Good day everyone, welcome to our third in the series of our talks, and today we're going to be focusing primarily on sustainability, and we have with us today our guest, Mr. Alex Malouf, who is Director of Communications at Schneider Electric. If we could just ask you to introduce yourself.
Sure.
First of all, a little bit about your background, the company, and then we'll sort of get into a Q&A session primarily focusing on sustainability in the UAE and what this means moving forward towards the 2050 plan of net zero.
So appreciate the intro. Good to be here, Jonathan.
You're welcome.
With you as well, Michael.
Yeah, good to meet you.
So my name is Alex Malouf. I look after corporate communications for Schneider Electric, which is proudly, I could say, the most sustainable company in the world based on corporate nights for 2021. So it's a great topic to talk about, because also we have COP26, we have so many other things which are happening, obviously with net zero also being announced by the UAE, by Saudi and by Bahrain. So there's a lot happening right now.
We agree.
And what we've got to sort of work out is how do we get there, because 2050, 2060 seems a long way away, but it's not.
So start us off with the question which certainly a lot of people, I'm sure even I have, is what is the meaning of net zero? What are we going towards?
So basically net zero is about your carbon emissions, and it's essentially about not putting out any carbon emissions. So you actually have, essentially when you do something, and this is also where it gets interesting because you've got different scopes when it comes to net zero, but essentially your organization doesn't put out any carbon emissions. So it is carbon neutral, or it can even be better, you can actually be using excess resources, probably the wrong way of saying it, but you're essentially taking out carbon from the atmosphere.
So elaborate a little bit further. How do we do that? You know, for example, we drive to work, we burn fossil fuels, we use electricity as energy to air condition the space. I've even heard recently, by the way, that there's an initiative to focus on net zero carbon neutral track days for motor enthusiasts for racing.
Wow.
So I don't know how that will work, but I'm sure it's along the same principles. So how can we as a business, given that we are not producing anything, we don't have effluent going out of the building, we're not burning anything in our organization.
You're not manufacturing anything.
So how can we contribute to the market as a whole?
So there's a couple of basics here. It's a big subject. You have a lot of consultancy work, and we do consulting work on net zero for our clients. But essentially what you're looking at doing is reducing your usage of hydrocarbons. So it could be about driving your car, switching to an electric vehicle. That's one sort of way of doing it. But then you've also got the issue of how is that energy electricity being produced?
Sure.
Are you taking it from renewable sources? So that's one piece. So essentially transportation. Then it's getting into the office. So how is your electricity being produced for your office? Is it coming again from renewable sources? It could be solar, it could be wind, it could be hydro, geothermal. Nuclear is also counted as well. So you've got those elements, but what are you also doing in terms of the materials you're using? Think about it. Are you reducing? Are you reusing? Are you recycling? And that's essentially how you're going to look at net zero. It's not the easiest thing to work out because it can get really complex, especially if you're a booster. So for example, I used to work in FMCG. My company would produce detergent powder for using washing machines, so that is counted in terms of your carbon emissions, because that's one of your products. So how are people washing, for example, and switching from 60 degrees to 40 degrees in terms of a washing cycle really reduces the amount of energy being used. So there's a lot of things in this, but the ultimate ambition is to ensure that no excess carbon is pushed out into the atmosphere.
I guess there's an element of something is better than nothing. So that if we are able to contribute, we may not be able to achieve net zero as an entity or as an individual, but if we're contributing something to that, we are actually contributing to the community as a whole. What is your view, Michael?
I mean, one of the things I wanted to ask you, Alex, is that the IPCC have produced their latest report, And you know, that just, you know, a couple of headlines there say it's unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean and land. And they're saying human-induced climate change is already affecting many weather and climate extremes. So, you know, the scientists are saying there's no doubt, there is no doubt. And yet you still hear a lot of skepticism from people. How do you get around that? Do you think that's changing? Do you really, you know, you have these targets, you have scientists continually saying this is happening, this is happening now, and yet, you know, you visit your Facebook or you talk to people on the street and you still hear people saying this isn't real. You know, how do you get over that?
Well, you know, as an infamous British politician said, you know, who wants to listen to the experts? Nobody believes the experts anymore. Yeah, thank you, Michael Gove. I think that we've had it from scientists. There's obviously been pushback from certain industries because if you look, even in our region, the economy is based on hydrocarbons. It's based on oil and gas. Simple as that. You look at countries like Australia, the amount of coal they export, huge amounts. But I think people have no choice but to realise what is happening because they're seeing it around them. This summer we've had massive fires in Turkey, Greece, we've had it in North Africa, mainly in Algeria, we have it increasingly in places like California. We've seen the climate change right in front of us. Within this region we've had droughts, massive droughts in Iran and also in Iraq. We've seen the number of days where temperatures are increasing and actually exceeding 50 degrees Celsius is doubling across the world, but even more so here. And it's just going to become unlivable. And that's the challenge we've got. Now, you've had other reports. UNICEF put one out, which was a brilliant report, saying that up to 1 billion children are going to be impacted by climate change. You know, so the scale and scope of this, and it's not just simply about society, but it's also about business. You know, the impact it's going to have in terms of business. You know, you think about economies here. Dubai is very much a tourism-based economy. You know, what is going to happen in terms of the shoreline, for example? So it's going to affect all of us. And you know, if people don't realise it by now, I don't know what's going to happen. Because
I think one example we could potentially give here is the palm. You know, it was a development which largely started 15 years ago, 16 years ago, and it was like a virgin island, let's say, and now it's questionable whether any further development on it is sustainable due to the infrastructure that's in place and the limitations that are imposed by that. And the same thing, I think, applies to cities in the world. We see cities such as Cairo at a breaking point in terms of its population increases, whereby Egypt are, you know, expanding new cities within the country. What do you think about the UAE in terms of its strategy, its vision, in terms of, you know, the whole sustainability plan? Is it achievable, given that the market here is, as you mentioned, based around oil and gas? It's also based around construction, tourism, all of these key markets, but which all produce things that are largely against environmental sustainability, shall we say.
The aspect of going for net zero as a country is that you don't count your exports. So oil and gas isn't counted in terms of that net zero target, which people have criticised, but that's just simply the structure of the frameworks which are being used. What is fascinating about what we're seeing in the Gulf is that these are very much government-led initiatives. You know, we've seen, for example, the solar parks here. We've got Baraka as well, the nuclear plant in Abu Dhabi, and the solar parks here, for example, are massive. But we've also got to involve business, and we've also got to involve the public as well.
So how big are the solar parks here, and how much, do you know how much electricity they generate, or what is the percentage input to the market?
They are among the biggest in the world. They're the biggest in the world. They've driven the price. This is the best thing in terms of what they've achieved. They've driven the price of solar to a new record low, which obviously is helping everybody else, because now renewable costs are much lower than, you know, your coal plants or other types of traditional hydrocarbon fuels. What we're looking at, and Dubai has its targets. I can't remember in terms of the top of my head, but they're pretty ambitious in terms of 2030, 2050. Abu Dhabi and the rest of the UAE also have their own targets as well. ADNOC announced yesterday that they're going to be working with, I think it's EWEC over in Abu Dhabi, to actually obtain all of their energy needs from renewable sources by a certain date. So, there's a push, but again, it's the question of what else can we do? What extra can we do? Because it's not just something about the generation piece. It's also about how we use energy as well. What we're doing in terms of transportation, and all of these things add up. So you've got to look at in terms of its entirety.
The government can do so much, and the influence of solar is interesting. When I first came to the UAE 2005, it was actually illegal to have a double connection to the grid. It was illegal. You could not feed power back to the grid. It was illegal. So they've over time they've changed that. They are encouraging people to put solar PV panels on their roof, and there's various schemes in DEWA. But at the end of the day, it's market driven, and if the buildings are owned by a landlord who's leasing to somebody, or people are renting their houses, why should they go out and spend money and put solar panels on their roof? Because then they're going to be there for 2 or 3 years and they're going to move on. So the market drives many of these things.
But maybe landlords are the target. If, for example, there are landlords who own a community development, or I'm not talking individual. Now, I'm talking about, let's say, the likes of developers such as Emaar, Al Wasl, etc., etc.
Well, they do. I'm in a Emaar villa now, and it does have solar thermal water, which makes absolute sense. When I first came to this region, you were using the cold water as the hot water, and vice versa, because you had an electric heater in the kitchen which was keeping the hot water cold, so you could use that as cold water, and you had a tank up on the roof which was supposed to be for the cold water.
Are the PV panels efficient on a domestic scale? Yeah. So technology has moved on, because certainly before I was of the opinion that they were not. They were there to comply with Estidama or LEED or these type of things, but they were not very efficient or not putting much in. But now has technology moved on?
Look, in terms of what you can do at homes, and this is what we're seeing in places like the US and Australia, you've got the rise of prosumers. So people who have got panels on their roofs, they've got batteries installed, and then they may even have electric vehicles, so that they can literally be off the grid if they wanted to. They have their own mini grid essentially. They use that for their own needs. If they want to sell back into the grid, they can also do that. You've got people in the UK doing that, and they're making good money in terms of feeding power back to the grid. But the challenge we've got here is that the market is not. It's a regulated market. We don't have deregulation. We have, wherever we live, we have one provider. There's no competition. Whereas you look at the US, this prosumer piece has been driven by the deregulation. The same in the UK, the same in other markets. So you've also got prices which fluctuate, whereas again here, prices are fixed. So,
but again, the US market is a very mature market. It has a population of 300 million people versus 10 million people. So I think they're two very different models in one sense. But what are Schneider doing? What are your initiatives in the region that are going to, you feel, make a change and maybe will help others see what they can do?
There's a couple elements here. So one of the biggest pieces that we look at is buildings. Buildings are essentially 40% of all carbon emissions. In terms of heating, in terms of where we are, it's all about cooling. It's obviously not heating, we don't have a heating issue here. So we've got to think, how can we try and use technology inside the buildings to reduce the power being used? And again, it's not that difficult to do it these days. Most of our buildings, they're already wired up. It's essentially about putting sensors in, using the software, and then cutting down energy requirements, energy resources, and that's doable. And you can see a return, say, in 2-3 years, if that.
I think this is a very clear message, and certainly one of which hoteliers, mall operators, these type of large buildings could really benefit from. When you walk into some of these spaces, even wintertime, and they're still running on full capacity, and they're maybe 16, 18 degrees, you think, wow, there's nobody got the foresight to, switch the BMS on, but maybe the system isn't working, maybe it's out of date, maybe it's not in line with, but there definitely is a wastage of energy here, of which we start to see not only in the summertime when the doors are open, so you can cool outside, but also in the wintertime when the equipment is being overutilized. Have you any initiatives or kind of, not a training plan, but some kind of a sales pitch to those type of building owners?
Look, we have a sales pitch. All the guys have
for everything.
As you can imagine, I think the challenge we've got, and we see it very much so with, what we were talking about before, when it comes to building owners and you've got tenants who may be coming in and out, is what is pushing them to go and invest. Because for them, look, it's an investment.
What's the return?
And we don't enough look at the total cost of ownership. It's very much piecemeal. You build the building, what is the cost, and then that's it. But in terms of overall costs, maintenance, can be half, if not more than the total cost.
This is exasperated when you have a situation where you very often you're working with developers here to develop a product, and you're looking at sustainable options. But the developer at the end of the day is leasing it onto somebody else, and they're paying the energy bills, not the developer. So we get this, for example, when you're developing, say, units for restaurants and things like that, and the restaurant owners are coming in, say, give me more power, give me more gas, give me, and at the end of the day, the developer's saying, okay, fine, he's not paying for it. There's no encouragement.
There's two elements to that. I think one, developers, because they're offloading the cost, they're not incentivized to put the most efficient kit in, which is obviously more expensive, but more efficient in terms of running costs, because they're not picking up the tab. They're kind of, not all, but a lot of them are bypassing that consideration. The second thing is here that a large amount of properties here are subsidized, i.e. if they're Emirati owned, they're subsidized in terms of the electricity costs. So I have a friend, for example, who has a workshop in Al Quoz, big workshop, and he has temperatures of, in the summertime, maybe 34 degrees in the workshop, even though he has AC pumping in. So I talked to him about insulating it, but he's not incentivized to insulate it because maybe he needs to spend 100,000 on insulation, whereas his monthly DEWA bill is 6,000. So even if we spend 100,000, what will it reduce his DEWA bill by? Let's say 1,500, 2,000 max. So the return is not there. And this is the challenge, I think, in the region, where there needs to be more incentives to encourage people to invest in more sustainable solutions. And I mean, what can Schneider do anything about that to educate the public, educate the powers that be, shall we say?
Well, I think that there's two simple ideas for this. One is going out, saying to the government, which we often do, there are programs or concepts you can roll out. So one is having an energy efficiency drive. And with that, you've got to have the funding available. Give people the option in terms of where they can get the funding from, so they can cover the upfront cost. And what you could even do, you could actually pay it back, that additional cost, for example, through your utility bills. Really simple idea. And then you have something which is more developed, which is this idea of having energy as a service. So you go to a third party, it could be us, it could be anybody else, and you say, look, this is our energy consumption, we want to reduce it. And then basically, the third party, the money they make is essentially the difference as to how much they reduce the energy bills.
Yeah.
You know, so that's the clear agreement, and that could be through technology. It could be through deregulated market, because that's really what you need. You know, we see a lot, for example, in places like Spain, where there's a lot of deregulation. But there are certain ideas you can come up with, and again, they've been done other places. If they can be done other places, they can definitely do it here. But it's the need for action. It's a need for creative thinking, and again, you know, if we can do it in other places, then let's bring it
But
here
the
as well.
market here is slightly different. So, for example, as Michael alluded to earlier, we have a huge rental market here. It's not there. It is becoming more of a homeowner market, but still, it's in the early stages compared to US, compared to UK. So, what we see in our business here is that when people buy a house, they're happy to spend money.
Yeah.
So, for example, someone would come to us and say, "We want to change all the lights in the house to LED," because they can see that that investment will have a repayment, both in terms of quality of lighting, longevity of the lighting, and bills, right? So they envisage that as a good investment. The problem is when you're renting an apartment, a villa here, etc., you're reluctant to invest in this type of thing because you won't see a return. And it's a little bit the same if we go back to the company level. What can we do as a company to what incentivizes us, apart from our good thinking or moral judgment, to contribute to a more sustainable future? And let's not take us, let's take a manufacturing facility, let's say in Russell or somewhere like that. You know, how can you convince them, how can the government convince them that, you know, this is what you should do? Should it be via tax breaks? Should it be via, you know, you already mentioned about loans, but maybe they won't use the loan for the right purpose. You know, can there be another way?
I think first of all, it's that shift in terms of thinking about sustainability. You know, I've worked in different companies, and they've always seen it as an opportunity to realize value. But again, you've got to look at it long term. You can't look at it in the space of 6 to 12 months. You've got to look at it further down the line. And you know, again, we've got some examples here. If you look, for example, at someone like Sustainable City, trying to get a place in there is good luck.
It's very popular.
It's really popular. It's obviously high end, but again, you know, if you look, say, at manufacturing, and this is where it also gets interesting, because we really saw this through the pandemic. If you invest in the tech, you can realize benefits in terms of less energy, especially for energy intensive industries. But also as well, you can become more resilient and agile, particularly if, and again, this is the big if you start investing in terms of your own energy resources on site. And we're seeing this now in terms of supply chain. We've got major issues, you know, around the world. We've also had obviously issues during the pandemic, but those who invested early in terms of the technology have seen benefits over the past 2 years, which they will continue to reap going forward. And that's the challenge. We can't be left behind. The country wants to be, for example, a leader in terms of smart manufacturing. And sustainability comes into that. So, you know, it's about resource efficiency, reducing costs, and it's being more productive than somebody else. And there's another element to that as well, which is carbon tax. You know, Europe has already introduced carbon taxes.
It is a thing here. We don't have any, whilst we don't have any incentives, we don't have, what's the opposite? De-incentives. There's no, for disincentive, there's no, for example, car tax. You know, if you come into Business Bay, you're not taxed for using a car versus metro, for example, which you will see in most major cities in the world. So maybe there also has to be a carrot and a stick approach.
Yeah, I mean, you know, so bringing it back to construction for, in particular, what I see is that when you look at design and the development, and you look at new buildings, there is definitely a move to use sustainable designs, and we have Estidama here, and people are following green building codes, and they are looking at actually the design of new buildings. But when it actually comes to the construction process, although that is part of Estidama as well, I don't see such a big drive towards sustainability during the construction process. And when I look at what's happened with health and safety, I mean, when it first came into the industry, you know, health and safety was absolutely abysmal. And there was you and I, you know, you just every day it was just health and safety.
It's the start of every meeting, the start of every toolbox talk. Every daily briefing.
If you didn't mention something about health and safety in every meeting, you were chastised. To me, that is the sort of drive that's needed with sustainability. But how do we drive that in the construction process so that people, when they go on site, this is the first thing they think of, health and safety, environment, sustainability.
I think a lot of people argue that there is a big drive in construction, certainly with, the PQP engineer, with the Estidama, with the materials, with, the processes of recycling, etc., etc. It's probably one of the leading, I think, industries in terms of, certainly on paper, sustainability.
Well, that's maybe the problem on paper.
Maybe. So, but I see a bigger issue being the stuff that's already built, that's coming potentially to the end of its viable life. Let's say buildings here that are 20 years old now, the AHUs, the equipment that's behind the scenes is beyond the end of its economical life, and there should be a bigger incentive, I think, for those building owners to retrofit new modern equipment. Instead of having to demolish their building, bring them back up to a nice standard, make the environment and the equipment better for the occupants, etc., etc. So that it's more sustainable to fix it than it is to demolish it and rebuild it.
And again, we've got examples here as well. If you look at the European Union, in terms of their sort of green economic recovery, they put in money for retrofitting buildings. And look, we don't need to start even with commercial buildings here. We can start with government buildings. There's enough.
Conservation is a big thing in Europe, for example. We don't have conservation so much here because we don't have so many old buildings. But the same philosophy, as you mentioned, can go towards, the retrofit, the upgrade. But again, I feel that a lot of businesses don't do it because if your business is going well, you have the money set aside to do it. If things are not so good, it's not a high priority, and that's the challenge, really.
The other element as well, which would be really interesting, is to actually have the energy rating listed. That would be fascinating, for example, for people who are renting. So if I'm going to rent an XYZ building, how much am I going to save in terms of my monthly payments? Because as we know, utility bills are not cheap here. So that pressure, both from your tenants, people who are putting the money down, from the government as well, I think is going to make developers
I think that would be a big incentive for people, certainly if they knew moving into a development that, look, here's how it's rated. A little bit like when you go to Carrefour and you buy the new refrigerator, it's all 3 stars, 5 stars, LG, whatever it is, and you do select it according to that, even though you don't really fully know how much you're going to save. But it is on the buyer's agenda,
It is if you look at if you buy a property in the UK, or you look at a property to buy in the UK, you do get exactly that same chart.
Oh wow!
And I think if people were renting properties here and they knew that they were choosing between two properties of the same price, and one had a C and one had an E.
But even as a purchaser, also that would be high on your agenda because you might be looking at a 5, 10, 15 year,
energy bill.
Plan, so it makes sense. Oh, interesting. Cool.
Okay, just to wrap up then, one question is around electric vehicles, and we see more and more Teslas around on the roads in the UAE. What can be done in terms of encouraging more use of EVs, and how can that improve the sustainability picture?
Look, it's all about infrastructure. You've got to be able to fuel up your Tesla or your Renault or your Audi, whatever it is, which has a plug. And there's more and more cars which have plugs these days. So the more infrastructure you have, the more you're going to see electric vehicles, and vice versa. So it feeds into each other. And this is also, again, it's a big selling point for developments. People who are going to buy electric vehicles are going to have higher incomes. But they're not going to come to you unless you've got your infrastructure, your charger fitted to the wall, or put in the compound, for example, or even put in the villa, or put whatever it may be. And I think that's again another big part of hitting that net zero target, because transportation is a double-digit percentage of all the carbon we're putting out. So, big role to play there. It would be great. You look at Europe. There's a lot of incentives in terms of US as well, in terms of electric vehicles. We have some in Dubai. I live in Abu Dhabi. I'm waiting for us to follow Dubai's example.
There incentives here?
Yeah, there's some incentives.
There's certainly a lot of incentives in terms of parking spots.
So the parking.
The electric parking spot is right there, right at the entrance. But I don't always see it linked to a charger, which is interesting. Getting a nice place when you go shopping is good, but if you can't charge your EV while you're there, then what's the point?
But again, if you look at, say, London, you don't pay the congestion charge, which is a huge hit. That's a big thing, and again, it's using the carrots. How are we going to get people?
But here, is it free to recharge at petrol stations or no?
Yeah. Okay. It's provided for, I think, a certain period of time. I've ordered my car. Now I'm talking with my developer in terms of putting a charger in.
Oh, wow.
Somebody else has it in the compound, so I know it's doable. I know it's possible, but again, we've got to think. Developers have got to think, how can we make it happen? Because that shift is going to happen faster than they realise.
Yeah.
And the last thing they want is angry tenants running after them. But what they should be asking for, what they should be pushing for, is get the infrastructure in, and then start using that as a marketing tool.
Okay. Super.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure.
Good.
Thank you, gents.
Thank you.